Layla had been walking the aisles of Flight 214 for nearly 6 years, and she knew every corner of the plane like the back of her hand. She loved flying, not in the way passengers did, staring out the window at clouds and cities far below, but in the quiet understanding of how each system worked, how passengers felt, and how small actions could prevent bigger problems. Today, she felt the usual mix of excitement and calm as she prepared for the flight from the busy city airport to the coastal town several hundred miles away. She smiled at the passengers, noticing the tired businessman adjusting his briefcase, the mother struggling with her restless toddler, and the young couple whispering and holding hands nervously. Each face told a story, and she took a moment to imagine what their day had been like. The cabin hummed with the normal chatter of travelers settling in, overhead bins closing and the subtle click of seatbelts fastening. Layla moved down the aisle, offering warm smiles and gentle words to anyone who looked nervous. She handed a small packet of toys to a frightened child, showing him a tiny airplane figure that made him giggle. She spoke softly to the elderly man who was clearly anxious about flying, explaining how smooth the upcoming journey would likely be and how she would check in on him during the flight. The small gestures, she knew, mattered more than anyone could guess. She made her way back to the galley and double-checked the supplies. Water, emergency kits, oxygen masks, and life vests, all were in their proper place. She liked to do more than just routine checks. She peeked into the cockpit door, just a sliver, watching the pilots as they ran through their own procedures. She didn't fully understand every technical detail, but she paid attention, knowing that knowledge could be useful in ways she didn't yet realize. The captain, a man with years of experience, nodded at her as she returned to her duties. His calm demeanor always reassured the crew and passengers alike. Layla liked that about him. She glanced around once more, noting every little thing like a quiet habit she had developed over the years. Nothing out of place, nothing unusual. She felt ready for a normal flight, for the calm and steady hours ahead. Once the plane was in the air, the city below shrinking into a patchwork of lights and streets, the passengers relaxed. Some dozed in their seats, others read quietly, and a few pressed their faces to the windows. Layla moved along the aisles, checking that everyone had their seatbelts fastened and offering drinks with a cheerful smile. Her movements were fluid, practiced, but always with attention to the people around her. Noticing who looked uneasy or restless, she helped a young woman calm her shaking hands, guiding her to breathe slowly and focus on something in the cabin rather than the unknown outside. It was during these hours that Layla felt at peace, walking among strangers who had become, for a brief time, part of a shared experience. She was aware of the small things that made travel smoother, the way to answer questions without sounding rushed, how to calm a crying child, how to notice subtle signs of distress among passengers. She had stories, little fragments she kept in her mind about people she had helped in the past. Those moments, small and quiet, felt important. She had never sought recognition for them. Seeing a passenger smile or relax made the long shifts worth it. Suddenly, a slight shudder ran through the plane. Layla paused, instinctively steadying herself against the galley counter. Passengers glanced around, some murmuring questions, but the shudder quickly passed. She smiled gently at them, saying it was likely just a small turbulence, something common and harmless. Her voice was calm, her tone reassuring. She had learned that people often mirrored the crew's emotions. If she remained calm, the passengers would feel safe, at least for the moment. She returned to her rounds, checking on passengers and chatting lightly to keep the mood relaxed. A man 2 rows back was clearly anxious, gripping the armrests tightly, his knuckles white. Layla knelt beside him, offering a quiet conversation, telling him about her love for flight and how turbulence was a natural part of air travel. He smiled weakly, nodding, and settled back into his seat. She felt a small satisfaction in that connection, knowing that even in these tiny moments she had made a difference. The hours passed, the plane steady and smooth. Layla checked in with her fellow crew members, exchanging quiet smiles and occasional jokes, maintaining a sense of calm and normalcy in the cabin. She noticed the young couple by the window, now holding hands more tightly, still nervous but soothed by her attentive presence. The mother with the toddler had found a rhythm, the child finally asleep and the mother giving Layla a grateful glance. Everything seemed ordinary, routine, the kind of quiet day she had grown to expect and love. Layla herself felt a sense of satisfaction. She had always taken pride in her ability to stay composed, to handle whatever might arise with calm and careful attention. She liked being ready, even for unexpected situations, though she never imagined the day would test her courage in ways she could not have prepared for. She glanced out the window, watching the sun rise above the clouds, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful, peaceful, and deceptive. The calm did not last. A sudden jolt shook the plane violently, far stronger than normal turbulence. Screams erupted from passengers, children cried, and luggage tumbled from the overhead bins. Layla grabbed onto the nearest secure surface, her mind racing but her voice immediately cutting through the chaos, calm and commanding. She instructed passengers to fasten seatbelts, to stay seated, to breathe slowly. Her training kicked in, her instincts honed from years of preparation, yet beneath the composed exterior her heart pounded. Something was very wrong. She glanced toward the cockpit where she saw the captain struggling with the controls, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The co-pilot appeared disoriented, fumbling with switches and instruments. Panic threatened to overtake the cabin, but Layla moved among the passengers, her presence a steadying force. She whispered reassurances, helped terrified individuals grip their seats, and maintained a sense of order where fear threatened to take hold. Layla's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. She had observed the pilots countless times, had paid attention to procedures, but she had never flown a plane herself. Still, she remembered every detail, every instruction she had ever absorbed from safety briefings and cockpit visits. She realized that if the pilots could not regain control, the lives of everyone on board would fall into her hands, in ways she had never imagined. The cabin shook again, stronger this time, and a low, terrifying roar filled the air. Layla held herself steady, guiding passengers to cling to anything secure. The mother with the toddler pressed her face into her hands, and the young couple held each other tightly. Eyes wide with fear, Layla knelt beside the young couple, speaking softly but firmly, telling them she was there, that she would do everything she could. She could feel the tension, the fear, the sheer uncertainty pressing down on everyone, and in that moment she made a silent vow. She would try. She whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "I can try." It was not a boast, not a declaration, but a promise. A promise to herself and to the people around her. She did not know what trying would involve, how she could manage what she had only observed but never practiced. But she knew she could not give up, not now, not when lives hung in the balance. Layla's voice carried through the cabin, calm but firm, as she moved from passenger to passenger, checking on them, giving instructions, offering comfort. She realized that for now her role was not just about safety demonstrations or service. It was about keeping hope alive. Every soothing word, every gentle gesture became a lifeline. She understood that in moments of terror, people often held on not just to the aircraft, but to the presence of someone who could anchor them, someone who would not panic. The plane trembled again, violently, and this time, she knew the situation was more critical than she had feared. The captain's voice was strained over the intercom, and then suddenly, silence from the cockpit. Her stomach dropped. She realized what she had to do next. The passengers looked to her, eyes wide, gripping seats, holding onto anything that might keep them safe. And in that silent moment she whispered again, more firmly this time, "I can try." It was not just a thought, it was a decision. She would step into the unknown and take action, even without certainty, even without complete knowledge. She would try. As the plane continued its tumultuous flight, Layla prepared herself for what was coming. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, and began moving toward the cockpit. The aisle seemed longer than it ever had. Passengers' faces a mix of fear, hope, and reliance on her. Each step was heavy with responsibility, but she did not hesitate. She would face whatever came next. She would try, and that promise, quiet but unwavering, would guide her through the storm. Layla took a deep breath as she stepped closer to the cockpit door, her heart hammering in her chest. The roar of the engines was deafening now, mixed with the terrified cries of passengers. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the fear etched on every face, and knew she had to act quickly. She could no longer stay in the safety of serving drinks or calming nervous passengers. The plane needed someone in the cockpit, and if the pilots could not manage, that someone had to be her. She reached the door and pushed it open, a sharp metallic groan echoing in the narrow space. Inside, the cockpit was chaos. Papers flew around, instruments blinked erratically, and alarms shrieked. The captain was slumped over the controls, pale and weak, his eyes barely open. The co-pilot was on the floor, clutching his head, clearly unconscious or worse. Layla's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to focus. She had watched these pilots for years. She knew the basics. She had learned the sounds, the movements, and the reactions. She would have to rely on that. She stepped over the co-pilot, her hands brushing against switches and levers she recognized from observation. Her mind raced as she tried to remember what each control did. She focused on the yoke, the throttle, and the rudder pedals, repeating the little she knew in her head. She could hear the passengers behind her, their fear palpable, but she blocked it out, narrowing her attention to the task ahead. The plane was losing altitude fast, and she had to stabilize it. Layla grabbed the yoke, gripping it tightly. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve held firm. She remembered the captain's voice from countless safety demonstrations and quiet cockpit moments, explaining gentle turns, how to level the plane, how to listen to the instruments. She tried to apply that knowledge, nudging the controls carefully, listening to the feedback, feeling how the plane responded. The first moments were terrifying. The aircraft dipped, shuddered, and leaned sharply to one side, sending her stomach flipping. She steadied herself and tried again, whispering to herself, "I can do this. I have to try." Back in the cabin, passengers were screaming, gripping their armrests. Some had tears streaming down their faces, while others clung to loved ones, whispering desperate prayers. Layla glanced briefly through the cockpit window at them. She wanted to assure them, to tell them everything would be okay, but she couldn't speak yet. Not until the plane stopped its violent descent. She focused, each small adjustment a battle against panic, gravity, and chaos. The alarms were relentless, piercing and urgent, warning of failing systems and decreasing altitude. Layla's mind worked frantically, recalling bits of information she had overheard or read in manuals lying around the crew lounge. She adjusted the throttle slightly, trying to slow the drop. She tilted the plane cautiously, attempting to level it with gentle pressure on the yoke. For a moment, there was a glimmer of hope as the plane seemed to respond, its violent shudders easing slightly. The cabin reacted almost immediately. Gasps replaced screams, and some passengers dared a glance out the windows, seeing the clouds rushing past but sensing the plane was not tumbling uncontrollably. Layla allowed herself a brief silent breath. She knew it was only temporary. The plane was still unstable, and any wrong move could make things worse. She focused on the instruments, reading every gauge, every dial, every light, relying on intuition and memory to guide her actions. She reached for the radio, her hands shaking, and pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 214, pilot incapacitated. Need emergency instructions, over." Her voice was steady, firm, even though inside her fear threatened to paralyze her. There was static at first, then a calm voice returned, identifying themselves as air traffic control. They guided her with clear, simple instructions, each word a lifeline. Layla repeated the instructions aloud, her voice barely above a whisper to herself, then followed them. She adjusted flaps, throttled the engines, and slowly worked to stabilize the plane's descent. Sweat poured down her face, her arms ached, but she refused to give in. She could hear the passengers behind her, the collective anxiety vibrating through the cabin. Every small adjustment she made, every tiny success, gave her courage to continue. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was the plane's lifeline. Minutes stretched endlessly. Each second felt like an eternity, but gradually the plane's violent movements lessened. Layla began to feel a faint rhythm, a fragile sense of control. She dared a glance behind her, seeing the passengers watching her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She gave them a reassuring nod, a silent message that she would do everything she could. Some of them clutched each other more tightly. Some whispered prayers, and some simply held on, eyes wide. They had no idea the magnitude of what was happening just beyond the cockpit. Layla's thoughts flashed to her family, to memories of her childhood fascination with planes. She remembered sitting by the window as a child, watching them soar, wondering how anyone controlled such enormous machines. She remembered helping her younger brother assemble model airplanes, explaining how parts worked, imagining the physics she didn't fully understand. All those small, innocent moments had prepared her for this in ways she could never have imagined. Now every memory was a tool, every lesson an anchor. The plane shuddered again, a violent jerk that sent a tray flying and knocked a passenger into the seat in front of them. Layla's grip on the yoke tightened, knuckles white. She whispered to herself, steadying her hands and her heart. I can try, she repeated louder this time. The words became a mantra, a promise she refused to break. She would not give up. Not now. Not when lives depended on her actions. Air traffic control continued their calm, precise instructions. Turn slightly to heading 270. Reduce speed gradually. Prepare for emergency landing. Layla repeated the words, absorbing them, acting as quickly as she could while ensuring she did not make sudden movements that could worsen the situation. The plane responded slowly, hesitantly, but it did respond. She allowed herself a brief acknowledgement of progress before returning her focus fully to the controls. She adjusted the yoke again, feeling the plane respond more steadily. Each small success, each tiny moment of stability, brought a surge of adrenaline mixed with relief. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead, landing. She could keep the plane from falling perhaps, but bringing it safely to the ground was a challenge far beyond what she had ever faced. Yet she refused to let fear take hold. Every passenger's life rested in her hands now, and she would do everything she could to protect them. In the cabin, the mood shifted slowly. The crying subsided a little, replaced by whispered conversations and anxious glances toward the cockpit. Passengers clung to hope, some daring to smile when they saw Layla's calm, determined expression through the window of the cockpit door. The mother with the toddler whispered thanks, tears running down her cheeks. The young couple held hands tighter, a silent connection born from shared fear and trust. The passengers' fear had not disappeared, but Layla's courage had given them a fragile anchor. Minutes passed in tense focus. Layla navigated the plane with care, responding to every instruction, every alarm, every movement with precision she didn't know she possessed. She could feel exhaustion creeping into her arms and shoulders, but she refused to let it slow her down. The plane was responding better now, not perfectly, but enough that the immediate threat of uncontrolled descent was easing. She glanced at the instruments, noting the altitude, speed, and heading. Everything had to be adjusted carefully, step by step, minute by minute. She felt like she was dancing with the plane, each movement deliberate, each adjustment critical. Her training, her observation, and her courage combined to keep the aircraft in the air. She whispered again, quietly but firmly, "I can try." It was no longer just words. It was determination, action, and hope all rolled into one. Finally, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The plane's violent shaking had lessened, and though it still needed guidance, it was no longer in free fall. She could hear the relief in the cabin, subtle but present, and it fueled her resolve. The passenger's trust, even if unspoken, was now part of her responsibility, a weight she carried with both fear and determination. Layla knew this was only the beginning. Stabilizing the plane was one thing, bringing it safely to the ground was another. But for now, she had taken the first, most critical step. She had stepped up when no one else could, faced the chaos, and refused to surrender to panic. Her mantra echoed in her mind, a quiet but unbreakable promise. "I can try." And with that promise, she prepared herself for the next challenge, knowing that the lives of everyone on board depended on her courage and determination. Layla's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the yoke, sweat streaming down her face. The plane had stopped its wild tumble, but the struggle was far from over. Every warning light in the cockpit flashed urgently. Alarms continued to shriek, and outside clouds rushed by at an alarming rate. She had never flown a plane herself, but the years of observation, small lessons, and quiet curiosity gave her a foundation she now depended on completely. She took a deep breath and spoke into the radio again, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Control Tower, Flight 214. We are stabilizing, but we need step-by-step guidance for landing. Pilot incapacitated. Please instruct." Static replied for a few seconds, then a calm, clear voice came through, giving her precise instructions, breaking down each action into simple steps. She repeated each instruction aloud before acting, focusing all her attention on translating words into action. The first step was to adjust the plane's speed and angle to prepare for descent. Layla's hands moved carefully, guided by memory and intuition. She felt every vibration, every tremor of the plane, and tried to interpret what the aircraft needed. One wrong move could mean disaster, but she refused to freeze. She thought of the passengers, the family holding each other tightly, the mother shielding her child, and the young couple clinging to hope. She would not let them down. As she worked, memories of her childhood love for flight came back in flashes. She remembered staring at planes soaring in the sky, imagining the lives inside them. She recalled sitting at the airport with her father, watching takeoffs and landings, fascinated by the control towers, the runways, the pilots moving with quiet authority. Those years of fascination had never felt useful until now, but they gave her courage, a mental map of how things might move and respond. The plane rocked again, violently, a reminder of the fragility of their situation. Layla adjusted the controls carefully, recalling the subtle movements she had observed in the cockpit. The plane responded, not perfectly, but enough that she could feel some control returning. Her focus narrowed to a single point. Keep the plane steady, keep it from falling, and follow the instructions. She blocked out fear, adrenaline, and the screaming of alarms, centering entirely on the task. She glanced briefly toward the cabin through the small cockpit window. Passengers were holding on, wide-eyed, some praying, some silently gripping armrests. Her presence in the cockpit, though unknown to them, gave her a responsibility heavier than she had ever faced. Every small movement of the yoke, every adjustment of the throttle was a step toward keeping them alive. She whispered to herself again, softly but firmly, "I can try," and let the words become a mantra driving her forward. The control tower instructed her to check the flaps, adjust the angle of descent, and maintain a stable heading. Layla followed each instruction with painstaking care, feeling the plane's reactions through every vibration and subtle motion. Her palms ached from gripping the yoke. Her arms were stiff, but she forced herself to ignore the discomfort. There was no room for weakness. She had to be precise, deliberate, and unwavering. As the minutes passed, she began to notice subtle signs of progress. The plane's violent jerks were less frequent, its angle more stable. The instruments still flashed warnings, but she was learning to interpret them, adjusting her movements carefully. Each small victory brought a surge of relief and renewed energy. She reminded herself to breathe, to stay calm, and to focus entirely on the next necessary action. She remembered every detail she had absorbed during safety briefings and casual observations in the cockpit. The way pilots managed minor adjustments, how they responded to alerts, how they communicated with the tower. She replicated each action as best she could, relying on muscle memory and intuition. She could feel the plane's resistance, the subtle push and pull of the engines, and adjusted accordingly. It was a delicate dance between understanding the aircraft and trusting her instincts. The passengers, though unaware of the precise situation, sensed a change. Some stopped crying, their attention drawn to the calm figure moving in the cockpit. A few whispered words of reassurance to each other, a fragile hope forming in their hearts. Layla's determination, though silent to them, radiated outward, influencing the cabin. She had become their unseen anchor. The control tower continued guiding her, their voice steady and precise. They instructed her on altitude, speed, and trajectory, breaking each command into small, manageable steps. Layla repeated them aloud, confirming each action, then executed them with careful attention. The plane responded gradually, its erratic movements smoothing out slightly. It was still a fight, but for the first time since the incident began, there was a sense of fragile control. Suddenly, another alarm blared. Layla's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. The indicator showed a minor system failure, something the pilots had trained for but she had only observed. She analyzed the options in seconds, recalling similar situations she had seen handled in the cockpit. Carefully, she followed the procedure, isolating the problem and stabilizing the system. The alarm quieted. Relief washed over her, but she could not linger. There were still miles to cover and a landing to execute. Her mind flashed back to the passengers again. She pictured their faces, the fear in their eyes, the trust they placed in someone they did not even know. That image strengthened her resolve. She would not allow panic to take over, not in the cockpit, not in the cabin. Every decision, every small adjustment had to be made with clarity and courage. She whispered once more, "I can try," letting the words steady her. Time became a blur. Layla's focus narrowed to instruments, controls, and instructions. The world outside the cockpit seemed distant, reduced to clouds rushing past in the faint horizon. She felt fatigue pressing against her, but she refused to let it dominate. She took brief moments to flex her fingers, steady her arms, and take a shallow breath. Every second of focus was critical. Every movement could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The plane's descent continued, and the next challenge loomed, approaching the airport. The control tower began guiding her with detailed instructions for alignment, altitude adjustments, and speed management. Layla listened carefully, repeating each instruction to ensure she understood, then acted with careful precision. She could feel the plane's weight shifting, engines humming, and slowly, cautiously, she began to bring it closer to the runway. As she navigated this treacherous path, memories of her training and observations became tools. She remembered the captain showing how to adjust flaps for landing, how to maintain speed while approaching the runway, how to anticipate the plane's reaction to every movement. Each memory was now practical knowledge, helping her make real-time decisions that would determine the fate of everyone on board. The plane shuddered slightly as it encountered turbulence near the airport, and Layla's grip on the yoke tightened. Her heart raced, but she steadied herself, recalling every instruction, every observation, every lesson she had absorbed over the years. She could feel the plane responding to her adjustments, slowly but steadily moving toward alignment with the runway. She whispered almost to herself, "I can try," each repetition reinforcing her determination. Inside the cabin, passengers sensed the change in motion. The plane was stabilizing, responding to something, and a cautious hope began to spread. Some whispered prayers, some held their loved ones tightly, but a shared sense of anticipation filled the air. Layla's calm presence, though unseen by many, had created a ripple of reassurance. Layla's focus intensified. She was approaching the critical stage of landing. She monitored altitude, speed, and alignment, making minute adjustments, listening to every sound, feeling every vibration. Her entire being was concentrated on keeping the plane steady and following the instructions from the control tower. Each decision was deliberate, each movement calculated. The responsibility was immense, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The runway grew closer, though it was still a distant line below. The plane was responding better now, its movements smoother, less erratic. Layla could feel the combined weight of her determination and the passengers' unspoken trust propelling her forward. She whispered again, quietly but firmly, "I can try." The words now a steady rhythm guiding her hands and mind. The plane shuddered slightly one last time as it prepared for the final approach. Layla adjusted the controls carefully, maintaining alignment and speed. The runway grew larger, clearer, and the plane's descent slowed to a manageable rate. Her hands were steady, her focus unbroken. She could almost feel the tension in the cabin, the collective holding of breath. She reminded herself to stay calm, to continue each careful step until the moment of landing arrived. Layla's determination carried her through the next moments, each adjustment bringing them closer to safety. She relied on intuition, observation, and the guidance from air traffic control. The plane responded, slowly descending toward the runway, more stable now than at any point since the initial crisis. Each second of calm, each small correction was a victory, and she clung to them, refusing to lose focus. As the runway approached, Layla's mind sharpened to the present, letting go of fear and focusing entirely on the controls and instruments. Every movement had purpose, every decision mattered. She repeated her mantra one last time, softly but with absolute conviction. "I can try." It was no longer a whisper of doubt. It was a declaration of resolve, courage, and determination. And with that resolve, she guided the plane, steady, focused, and ready for the final challenge that would define this extraordinary flight. Layla could feel the runway getting closer, the ground approaching faster than she had imagined. The plane was steadier now, but the danger was still present. Every instrument, every vibration, every sound mattered. She had to keep her focus entirely on the task at hand. The cabin was quieter than before. Passengers were gripping their seats, holding on to loved ones, some whispering prayers, all trusting someone they barely knew with their lives. She adjusted the throttle slightly, following instructions from air traffic control. Each small movement of the yoke had to be precise. She recalled every detail she had learned from observing pilots, every subtle correction and adjustment they had made during their own flights. It was all coming together now. She had to rely on intuition as much as instruction. The plane responded slowly, obediently, as if it could sense her determination. The control tower gave another set of instructions. The runway was straight ahead, but there were gusts of wind coming from the side, making the landing more difficult. Layla followed every command, adjusting the angle, the speed, and the descent carefully. She felt the strain in her arms, the tension in her shoulders, the sweat running down her face, but she refused to let it slow her down. Every passenger on board was depending on her. She glanced briefly at the instruments, noting the altitude, speed, and alignment. She had never been so aware of every single detail in her life, she whispered to herself as she had throughout the ordeal. I can try. These words were no longer just encouragement. They were the thread holding together her courage and focus. The plane began to sway slightly with the wind, and Layla corrected it with delicate adjustments. She could hear the faint whimpers and whispers in the cabin. The sounds of fear and hope mingled together. She imagined each passenger's story. The business person heading to an important meeting, the mother worried for her child, the couple celebrating a special occasion. Each of them gave her strength. She would not let them down. Minutes felt like hours as she slowly guided the plane closer to the runway. Every movement had to be exact. The control tower continued providing calm, clear instructions, and she followed them meticulously. She adjusted the flaps, balanced the engines, and guided the plane's angle, feeling each shift and response. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. Every action was deliberate, controlled, and focused on survival. The plane dipped slightly as it approached the runway, and she held her breath. She had to time this perfectly. Too fast, and they could overshoot. Too slow, and the landing would be rough, maybe dangerous. She relied on every small lesson she had absorbed over the years, every observation, every training moment, and instinctively adjusted her hands and feet. The plane seemed to respond to her focus as though it knew she was determined to succeed. In the cabin, the passengers were silent, sensing the critical moment approaching. Some prayed aloud, others held their children tightly, and some simply stared ahead trying to stay calm. They had no idea how close they were to disaster, or how much courage the young woman guiding the plane was summoning from within herself. They could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of fear, hope, and reliance on someone they trusted completely in this life-or-death moment. Layla's thoughts flashed to her family, to her childhood, and to all the small moments that had shaped her life. She remembered sitting at the airport as a child, watching planes take off and land, fascinated by the precision and control of pilots. She remembered helping her younger brother assemble model planes, explaining how parts worked, imagining physics she didn't fully understand. She realized that all these years of fascination had quietly prepared her for this moment. The plane shuddered as it hit a gust of wind, and Layla's hands tightened on the controls. She whispered softly to herself, I can try. She repeated it like a mantra, a reminder of her resolve. The plane responded to her adjustments, stabilizing as she guided it carefully toward the runway. She focused entirely on the instruments, the feel of the plane, and the instructions from air traffic control. There was no room for hesitation or fear. She felt the tension in her arms, the fatigue in her body, but she ignored it, relying on determination and focus. The runway was now clearly visible, a strip of safety among the clouds and chaos. She adjusted the plane's speed and angle carefully, guiding it in a smooth descent. The passengers' eyes were wide, some holding their breath, some whispering prayers, all sensing the critical moment. Layla's mind worked in precise calculations, though not consciously. She judged speed, height, and angle through instinct and observation, drawing on every memory of flights she had seen and instructions she had heard. The plane responded, moving steadily, though the gusts continued to push against it. She corrected each sway, each tilt, each movement with meticulous care. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her, but she embraced it. She had to. As the runway approached, she continued to make small adjustments. She balanced the engines, watched the instruments, and guided the plane's descent with steady hands. The plane dipped closer, the ground rushing up to meet them, and she felt the collective tension of everyone on board. The passengers gripped their seats, held each other tightly, prayed silently, and whispered words of hope. They had no idea the courage that guided the plane. Layla whispered again, softly but firmly, I can try. She repeated it, letting the words guide her movements. She guided the plane closer, correcting each slight deviation, listening to the hum of the engines, the vibrations, the faint sounds of the wind. Her focus was absolute. There was no room for distraction, only action, precision, and determination. The plane's wheels touched the runway with a jolt, and she felt a surge of relief mixed with tension. The plane skidded slightly on the wet tarmac, but she held it steady, adjusting the brakes and throttle as best she could. Each second was a battle, but she managed to keep the plane aligned, slowing its descent carefully. She could feel the tension in her body easing slightly, though her focus remained unwavering. Passengers gasped and whispered, some crying in relief, some clutching loved ones tightly, others silently thanking the unseen hand that guided them to safety. Layla kept her hands on the controls, guiding the plane down the runway, aware that the danger was not entirely over. She had to bring it to a complete stop safely, and every adjustment mattered. Finally, the plane slowed, the wheels gripping the tarmac steadily. Layla eased off the controls, letting the plane come to a full stop. She exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief washing over her. She had done it. She had taken control, guided the plane, and brought it closer to safety than anyone had dared hope. She glanced at the instruments, the runway, and finally through the cockpit window at the passengers. They were alive, shaken but alive. Tears streamed down faces, whispered thanks and prayers filled the air, and a fragile sense of calm began to return. Layla allowed herself a brief smile, knowing that she had held the plane and its passengers together through courage, determination, and the simple promise she had made to herself, to try. Even as emergency crews approached and the plane came to a complete stop, she remained alert, guiding the final adjustments, ensuring everyone's safety until the moment she could finally step away. She had faced fear, chaos, and responsibility far beyond what she had imagined and had emerged with lives saved. Her whispered mantra, repeated through panic and uncertainty, had been the anchor that carried her through. I can try, and that promise, simple yet powerful, had made all the difference. Layla felt her body relax slightly as the plane came to a complete stop on the runway. The engines were still humming, and the air outside was filled with the distant sounds of emergency vehicles rushing toward them. She kept her hands on the controls for a few more seconds, ensuring everything was stable. The passengers were alive, shaken but unharmed, and a wave of relief washed over her. She had done what seemed impossible, and yet, she knew the moment was not fully over. She had to ensure that everyone could leave the plane safely. Emergency crews arrived quickly, lights flashing, and began assessing the aircraft. Layla carefully followed each instruction from the ground personnel, guiding the plane into its final secured position. Every movement was deliberate. She still held onto the controls lightly just in case until she was certain there was no more danger. She glanced at the passengers, who were now looking out of the windows with wide, astonished eyes. Relief mixed with disbelief on their faces. They were alive, and they owed it to the quiet courage of the young woman who had stepped in when no one else could. The cabin doors opened, and flight attendants and emergency responders began helping passengers out. Mothers with children, elderly travelers, and young couples were guided carefully down the emergency slides. Passengers were still shaken, some crying, some hugging loved ones, all grateful. Layla moved slowly through the cabin, checking that no one was left behind, offering calm words to those too frightened to move quickly. She held a child's hand gently, helping them down, and whispered soothing words that calmed even the most anxious passengers. Her presence remained an anchor of safety. Finally, the last passenger exited and Layla followed. She felt the cool air of the tarmac on her face, mixed with the scent of fuel and the metallic tang of the plane. Emergency personnel approached her, expressing gratitude and astonishment at her bravery. They had never seen a flight attendant take control of a plane in such a way, stabilizing it and bringing it closer to safety. The captain and co-pilot, now being assisted by medical personnel, gave her weak nods of acknowledgement, respect, and gratitude. It was a moment she had not sought but deeply appreciated. Layla stepped away from the plane, finally allowing herself to breathe fully. Her hands, still slightly trembling from the strain, rested at her sides. She looked at the passengers who had gathered safely a short distance away. Some were hugging, some were laughing and crying at the same time, and others were simply standing in stunned relief. She realized that she had been part of something extraordinary, an act of courage and determination that had changed lives in a single afternoon. A young woman approached her, tears in her eyes. She clutched a child to her chest and whispered thanks. Another elderly man shook her hand, voice trembling as he expressed gratitude. Layla smiled softly, feeling a warmth that replaced the adrenaline of fear. She had acted without thought of recognition, purely driven by the responsibility and compassion she felt. Each moment of fear and determination had been a promise to herself, a simple whisper of resolve. I can try. News crews began to arrive, cameras capturing the scene. But Layla remained calm. She focused on ensuring passengers were safe, helping with minor injuries and speaking quietly to those still in shock. She had not sought fame or attention. Her goal had always been the lives of those on the plane. Yet the world would soon know of her courage, of how a young flight attendant had faced an unimaginable crisis and held it together when everyone else was helpless. As the emergency responders finished their work, Layla finally allowed herself to sit down on a nearby safety barrier. She felt exhaustion wash over her, deep and bone-tiring but mixed with a quiet pride. She had faced a situation that would have broken many, that had terrified even the most experienced pilots, and she had remained steady. She had kept everyone alive. Her whispered promise, "I can try," had carried her through. It had guided her hands, focused her mind, and given her the courage to act when there was no certainty of success. Passengers began gathering near her, still in shock but filled with gratitude. A mother placed a hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, just letting her presence communicate thanks. A young man held her hand briefly, tears in his eyes, and said simply, "You saved us." Layla nodded, feeling the weight of those words. She had not thought of herself in those moments, had only focused on action. Yet the acknowledgement was humbling and overwhelming. She thought back to the initial moments when the plane had gone into a wild tumble, the fear that had gripped her and every passenger. She remembered the panic, the cries, the alarms, and the feeling of helplessness. And she remembered the whisper that had saved her as much as it had guided her actions. "I can try." It had been more than a mantra. It had been a lifeline, a promise, and a source of courage that pushed her forward. Emergency crews had begun moving passengers to safer areas, and she walked alongside, helping guide them gently, offering reassurance, listening to their stories. Some spoke of the fear they had felt, some of the thoughts that had crossed their minds, and some simply clung to her for comfort. Layla listened patiently, never dismissing their emotions, offering only calm words and a quiet presence that made them feel secure. She understood that survival was not just about reaching the ground. It was about restoring calm and hope. The pilots, now attended by medical personnel, were stabilized. The captain approached her briefly, his voice weak but sincere. He thanked her, acknowledging that her actions had prevented a disaster. The co-pilot, still dazed, nodded in agreement. It was an acknowledgement that spoke volumes, though the passengers would never fully know the depth of her courage and skill. Layla felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not acted for recognition but for responsibility, and that alone was enough. News reporters began asking questions, but Layla politely declined, focusing on helping passengers and cooperating with emergency personnel. She understood that the story was extraordinary, but her priority was still the people she had just guided through terror. Her thoughts returned to the passengers, to their fear, their hope, and their gratitude. She realized that courage often came quietly, in moments when action mattered more than acknowledgement. Slowly, the situation began to settle. Passengers were being attended to. Emergency personnel were finishing their assessments, and the plane itself was now safely grounded and secured. Layla took a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the adrenaline fade and the exhaustion settle in. She had survived the impossible, guided others through it, and done so with determination, courage, and compassion. Her whispered mantra, repeated countless times through chaos and fear, had been the key. "I can try." She thought about the journey that had led her here, the years of fascination with flight, the quiet observations in the cockpit, the small acts of care and attention she had practiced every day. All of it had prepared her for this moment, though she had never imagined it would come to this. And yet, she had risen to the occasion, stepping into a role no one expected her to fill, and had succeeded. Layla watched as passengers began to leave the area, some hugging loved ones, others simply standing in quiet relief. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had made a difference in a way that mattered more than any accolade or recognition. She had acted with courage, presence of mind, and compassion. She had tried, and that attempt had been enough to save lives. Finally, she allowed herself to sit down, exhausted but grateful. She looked at the plane, still humming slightly, and at the people she had just guided through fear and uncertainty. The reality of what had happened began to settle in. She had faced an unimaginable challenge and had emerged with lives intact. Her whispered promise, repeated again and again, had been the anchor that held her steady. I can try. And it had been enough. Layla remained seated for a few moments longer, watching as emergency personnel completed their work and passengers reunited with loved ones. She felt the weight of relief, gratitude, and humility. She had been tested beyond measure and had risen to meet it. The plane, the passengers, the moment, they would all carry the memory of courage, determination, and quiet heroism. And for Layla, the simple promise she had whispered to herself throughout the ordeal had become a testament to the power of trying when it mattered most.